Let's begin then by talking a little bit about the question of free speech in liberal society broadly and in the academy in particular. You recently, a couple years ago, published a wonderful book called Speak Freely that discusses some of these issues. And I wonder if you can talk about a little bit about those.
Yeah, so Speak Freely is particularly focused on the context of universities and professorial speech, but also student speech on universities and why we ought to value speech in that particular context. Obviously, we're going through a moment in which there is unusual amounts of controversy about free speech in American society more generally across all kinds of venues with a wide range of speech. And as you suggested, I think free speech is really central to how a democracy ought to operate more broadly. And we care about free speech in society in part because of the need to be able to criticize government officials, criticize government policy, think about as a citizenry what kinds of policies and officials we want moving forward. We need a very robust space to be able to talk about those ideas and arguments and get ideas on the table for voters to be thinking about. In universities, we have a very particular reason to care about free speech, which is that we think free speech is essential to the advancement of truth. And what universities are primarily concerned with is advancing human knowledge and then communicating what is we think we know to the outside world, both sort of the general public, but also communicating to fellow scholars, communicating to students in the classroom and beyond. And so in that university context, in ways that are not quite the same as what we would think about in terms of democratic society more generally, but certainly in ways that are related. We likewise want to protect a sphere of intellectual freedom in which people could have really robust debates about important ideas within their disciplines, and that they can share their views about what they think the right answers are, often to very controversial questions, both to their fellow scholars and to their students. Unfortunately, we are in a situation now where not only is free speech being attacked in the broader world, it's also being attacked on university campuses. And we might have hoped that university campuses were a place where robust debate was particularly valued, and that we wanted to protect that kind of intellectual freedom to explore ideas. But increasingly, there's a lot of threats to that. Both students and faculty find their speech under attack. The scope of available arguments that are accepted on university campuses is shrinking. And especially for faculty, there's growing concerns that you might find yourself fired if you say the wrong things, whether in the classroom or in your publications or even in more public venues like social media. And so I think there's a great deal of interest and a great deal of need in universities to try to protect that sphere of intellectual freedom.
So responding to this need, you have recently founded a new group, the Academic Freedom Alliance, which is dedicating itself to addressing some of these issues. Could you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, so the Academic Freedom Alliance is a faculty-driven effort to try to defend academic freedom within American universities in particular. I think we are in the relatively fortunate place that faculty all through the 20th century argued for and advocated for getting protections for academic freedom built into university contracts, built into university governing documents in American universities. And as a consequence, there are a lot of rules on the books at most American universities. They're quite protective of faculty speech and protective of the right of faculty to teach their own classes, to have a great deal of freedom in how they teach their classes, to be free in their scholarship and their publication of their research, and even to be free in speaking to public audiences about matters of general concern. And in our current context, you might think about that in the context of social media, but early in the 20th century, there's a great deal of concern about faculty speaking out in op-eds or town meetings or various things of that sort. Early in the 20th century, faculty often found themselves fired by university presidents who were unhappy with what they were teaching, what their scholarship looked like, or what they'd say in the local newspaper. And university presidents had a great deal of discretion to do that. Over the course of the 20th century, we built in these principles of academic freedom to protect faculty and built up institutions like tenure to make it more difficult for university leaders to punish faculty when they said something controversial. And so we're in this fortunate situation that the rules on the books are quite good. Unfortunately, we're also in a situation where those rules are not always enforced, that faculty are not often in a good place to be able to take advantage of those rules. They don't always know about what their rights are. And so when they find themselves in the midst of one of these controversies over something that they've said, they've often find themselves in under a great deal of pressure to apologize, to back off, to restrict what they're doing. University leaders have a great deal of ability to push faculty around. What the Academic Freedom Alliance is designed to do is come to the assistance of faculty in those situations, lend them our support both publicly and privately to make sure the faculty recognize they're not alone, that they're aware of what their rights are, to make university leaders understand that somebody's looking over their shoulder and paying attention in the midst of these fights. And moreover, we're willing to provide support for legal assistance under these circumstances so that they can have legal advice to navigate these situations, hopefully in order to resolve any kind of disciplinary process in a positive way inside the universities, but if necessary to pursue litigation outside the universities in order to vindicate the speech rights of faculty.
So for faculty and others who might be interested to get involved or learn more about this, how could they do so?
So we have a website up for the Academic Freedom Alliance. It's academicfreedom.org, which provides some information about the organization, provides an opportunity to donate funds, and we are building funds for this. We are managing the growth of our membership over time. We want to make sure that we do bring in more people into the organization, but we don't want to do that willy-nilly because we want to make sure we have enough resources to be able to actually defend everybody in the organization to the extent that they need that kind of defense. And so we welcome inquiries about potential interest in joining, as well as simply people want to get on the email list and gain information about what we're doing. And in general, I would encourage faculty more broadly to speak out about these principles. Faculty often are not very well versed in their own rights and academic freedom, and faculty ought to, I think, not take those things for granted, but learn more about it, understand what those principles actually look like, and they ought to be willing to speak up for them in public and come to the defense of those that are under assault. And I think often we shy away from talking about these issues. Sometimes we shy away from them in the midst of particular controversies, both because we're intimidated by the controversy, but sometimes in our judgment, those particular people have said things that we disagree with ourselves personally, and so we might be reluctant to come to their defense. I think it's really essential that even people that you deeply disagree with, even if you think that they have said things that are quite wrong, it's important to come to the defense of their right to say it, because if we're not willing to defend people who we think are in error, we will soon find our own rights significantly restricted as a consequence.
So it would be an absolute error on our part to have one of the top constitutional scholars in the country here with us today and not ask a little bit about the more general relationship between the Constitution, the Supreme Court, and liberalism. And I'm wondering if you could just share a few of your thoughts about the importance of the Supreme Court as an institution and how that relates to classical liberalism and the Constitution.
Yeah, I think the court has played, in the American constitutional context in particular, has played a crucial role in defending individual rights and restrictions on political power and how it's exercised. I think sometimes we overplay how important the court has actually been in our politics over time. One lesson I think take away from the study that I did in Repugnant Laws, which looks at the history of how the court has reviewed federal statutes over time, is that the court is often expanding government power by upholding federal statutes against constitutional challenge, and they don't come to the defense of individual liberty, for example, as often as we might like. That's often the case that the justices on the court share the same inclinations and preferences and attitudes and values as other political leaders. And so if you find members of Congress or members of the executive branch restricting liberty, it's often the case the justices will go along with that. But nonetheless, justices, I think, have on the margins played a very important role in helping protect individuals. And free speech is one of the examples where the justices have actually been something in a leadership position all through the 20th century, at least, and thinking about these issues. Free speech is one of these contexts in which if you ask, for example, members of the general public how important is this as a general principle, even average citizens will say it's very important as a principle, at least until quite recently, that the idea of free speech is quite important. But if you start pressing people on particular controversies, particular instances of speech, people quickly start backpedaling. They find qualifications, they carve out exceptions to say, well, that's not the kind of speech I meant, and that shouldn't be protected. So unpopular speech, often people are willing to sacrifice and suppress despite their general commitments here. And politicians are the same. If they're in the midst of a controversy, the public really dislikes particular speech, elected politicians are likely to go along with that. Unelected judges can be really valuable in those circumstances, that they're more likely to stick to the principle, be willing to defend it, even in the context of unpopular speech. And so having an independent judiciary that's capable of implementing those kinds of principled abstract protections in concrete controversies, often when the people at stake are extremely unpopular, is just extraordinarily important. That's true about the free speech context. It's true in all kinds of due process context and criminal justice context, for example. And so it may well be true that the court broadly isn't willing to take a hatchet to statutes, but they can be quite important, I think, on these sort of more narrow questions of how do we effectuate constitutional rights in the context of particular controversies, and having an independent judiciary has been essential to that in the American context.
One last question. I wonder, in this time of kind of rising illiberalism on the right and the left, if you could say something about the relationship between the principles of liberalism and the good society, and whether you think it's possible to build a good society around, say, one group's notion of the common good, or another group's notion of what a better future would be like, rather than substantive due process and rule of law and these sort of principles. Could you comment on some of those issues?
Yeah, well, certainly one of the things I find very depressing about our current political situation is the rise of illiberalism on both the right and the left. You might imagine you might be a little more hopeful about the situation if there were merely illiberal forces arising on one end of this political spectrum. Maybe it'd be easier to imagine how you build a coalition to resist that and how you cabin those forces. But instead, I think we're seeing illiberal tendencies arising from all sorts of directions, which makes it much harder to build support for liberal values. One reason why I was interested in writing the book Speak Freely was precisely in order to try to explain some of those commitments and why they're actually valuable and why they're important for specific purposes in that context of how do you help universities serve their core function of helping to advance knowledge in the world. And I think likewise, we need to be able to try to explain to people why all kinds of core liberal values are important, why they help build a better society, they help make society work better, they help allow people to live together peacefully together. Speech is part of that, and so free speech principles have been in the very heart of the liberal tradition since its very origins, and remains critically important to liberal values more generally. And as I noted a while ago, free speech is critical to things like advancing the truth, and as a consequence, scientific progress, which is extraordinarily valuable for us as a society. And we lose something significant if we start restricting our ability to explore ideas and explore new boundaries of knowledge. But likewise, they're essential to democracy. It's how we're able to live together peacefully, make collective decisions without simply fighting with each other and settling our arguments and disagreements through brute force. And so you want a society in which we're capable of airing our disagreements and talking them through. It's an extraordinary advance for humanity that we were able to develop a politics in which it was possible to talk through our disagreements and make collective decisions. And it's not always going to be the case that we're going to persuade everybody to our point of view and that we're going to win those arguments when it comes time to take votes on them and make decisions about them. But our best hope of actually living together peacefully and making progress as a society is to take advantage of what are those traditional liberal values that help provide the kind of framework and structure that's not only important how society itself operates, but critically important to how the kind of diverse society that we hope to live in is going to operate as a peaceful and free society going forward.
Well, thank you so much for your time today, Professor Whittington. We deeply appreciate it.
Thank you. Appreciate it.